As of E3 2018, all eyes have turned toward The Elder Scrolls 6. After years of living off of the success of Skyrim, Bethesda finally announced that they are working, in some way, shape, or form, on the next entry in the Elder Scrolls series. So, with Skyrim being over 7 years old now, I wanted to take a look back at what was one of the most culturally significant games of its time. It is easy to forget what an impact Skyrim had on the general population. Back when it released in 2011, its success brought people into gaming that had never played video games before. It was talked about on the daily news. But then I took an arrow to the knee became a saying outside of the internet, outgrowing mere meme status. It was critically acclaimed, with the Xbox 360 version of the game scoring a 96 on Metacritic. Within the first few days of release, Skyrim sold over 3.4 million copies, with about 60% of those on the Xbox. By 2016, Skyrim had sold over 30 million copies, and since that time, both the Nintendo Switch and VR versions of the game had been released, so that number is presumably at least a few million more by now, at a minimum. Skyrim won Game of the Year by dozens of review outlets, including IGN and GameSpot, in a time when those outlets were much larger and more influential than they are today. However, because there has not been a follow-up to the game, and instead we have had numerous ports and re-releases, Skyrim itself has become a meme. To Bethesda's credit, they have embraced this, and at E3 2018, they announced the release of the Skyrim Very, Very Special Edition exclusively for Amazon Alexa. At the time, everyone thought that this was a parody, but no, it was an actual thing. So, let's take a look at the development, release, reception, ports, and lasting legacy of The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. After Bethesda released The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion in 2006, itself a big success, they began development on Fallout 3. During this time, pre-production on Skyrim began as well. With Fallout 3 releasing in 2008, Bethesda moved work on Skyrim into full production. This included rebuilding and expanding the creation engine to allow it to perform numerous new tasks that were not possible in Oblivion. Though we take it for granted now, some of these changes were at the time rather substantial. They included much farther draw distances, dynamic NPCs, much better lighting, the ability to give weight parameters to objects in the game world, and a huge improvement in the third-person perspective for players that wanted to play this way. Again, this is for the time, and it is true. All of these things, including the general graphics of the game, were substantially improved over Oblivion. Todd Howard said that roughly the first year of development was devoted simply to designing the game world. This is generally how Bethesda builds their open-world games. They create the landscape in which the story and quests will take place, and then they build those stories and quests around it. Another significant change from Oblivion was that character class was no longer a thing. In its place, Bethesda allowed for you to select one of 10 races, but then for the player to essentially choose what class they wanted to play as through actual gameplay. There was not going to be XP for killing enemies, rather, you gained experience for using your skills. The more you used a sword or a bow, the more you'd level up that particular skill. The enemies would dynamically scale in level, so in theory, there was always a chance you can proceed wherever you are on the map, within reason. This was a major departure from Oblivion and removed one of the biggest complaints of the time as it related to role-playing games. Players simply didn't like to be forced into a decision about their class before ever playing the game. What if they didn't like how bows or daggers worked in the game? If you already selected an archer or thief, you were stuck in that class forever. Skyrim changed that. It cannot be overstated how big of a change this was because it allowed more casual gamers the ability to get into the game, which significantly impacted how successful and culturally relevant it would become. The next few years of development, after the main map was created, were spent building the main story, dungeons, quests, lore, music, and other smaller details that fleshed out the game world. Early in development, the original main story quest was going to be centered around the Civil War taking place in Skyrim. This was eventually changed to the story we ended up with the rise of the dragons, the Dragonborn, and Alduin as the main antagonist. It is surmised that the Civil War quest was too ambitious to be pulled off on the hardware of the time, and indeed, with what we are left with, the battles and situations you are placed in lack the gravity I am sure Bethesda envisioned when these were storyboarded. Instead, the main story quest ended up being somewhat forgettable, but coupled with the Civil War storyline, it was enough to carry the game for players who were interested in completing it. Hundreds of smaller side quests and locations to explore would become the real meat of the game. Indeed, the ability to go anywhere or do anything was the key to Skyrim's success. Bethesda officially announced Skyrim in November of 2010 with the release date of 11/11/11, a date which they kept. All of these new features took the game world by storm. Bethesda knew they had a great game on their hands and spent millions of dollars in marketing on Skyrim. Those of us old enough to remember can easily recall the live-action trailer and commercial that accompanied the game's release. It was epic, and it still holds up today. Immediately selling millions of copies in the first few days, Skyrim would soon become a cultural phenomenon. Purely anecdotal, but during this time every single one of my gaming friends was playing Skyrim. This had never happened before, and it wouldn't happen again for another 7 years when Zelda Breath of the Wild released. Skyrim was talked about everywhere, as everyone was doing their own thing within the game world. Conversations about the game would be like, I found this drummer ruin last night and this is what happened. And then the group of everyone else was like, wow, where was that? I haven't seen it. To which the next person would say what they found, and so on. It was the type of game that you would get lost in for hours at a time, playing until 2 or 3 a.m. and not really getting a whole lot done. But then you spent all day thinking about what you'd be able to do again later that night and what quest you'd finally be able to complete. For many gamers, this was the first open world game that they had ever played. Even for those that played Fallout 3, Skyrim was fundamentally different in many ways. The experience was somewhat similar to Fallout 3 in that you could go anywhere, but the game world, number of characters, locations, and just sheer variety of things that you could do were so much greater in Skyrim that it didn't feel similar at all. With the power of hindsight and more Bethesda releases since then, the formula for their games is more readily recognizable, but back in 2011 this wasn't really a thing. It is hard to explain to those of you who weren't there at the time, but this new game world was so expansive that people legitimately thought that it was too large to explore. They thought that they could play Skyrim for years straight and still not see everything. For some players, that would turn out to be absolutely true, and this was prior to any DLC. There were towns and cities all over the map. There were endless caves, dungeons, and crypts to explore. There were numerous factions and guilds to either join or eliminate. Loot in Skyrim was popular before the idea of playing a game simply for loot was even a thing. All in all, Skyrim was so ubiquitous that for several months after its release, it was basically all that anyone played. So, in a world where we've become jaded by even the name Skyrim, it must be remembered that at the time of its release, it really was a groundbreaking title. Even the music, created by composer Jeremy Soule, has stood the test of time. Building on his works in Morrowind and Oblivion, he created his most varied and accomplished soundtrack yet. It would take over 4 discs for all of the tracks to fit on CD, and even to this day, his soundtrack remains one of the most popular ever released for a game. But Skyrim's popularity wasn't limited to what it did well. Besides arrow to the knee memes, the glitches within the game made it popular as well. Getting stuck in the game world, flying mammoths, frozen enemies, and more all plagued the release. This was in a time where daily and weekly patches were not a thing. While many of these issues would be fixed via patches, they took far longer. The PlayStation 3 version of the game would become almost unplayable after a certain number of hours, and this was never fixed. Though the PC version of the game was by far the smallest portion of the user base, selling only 14% of all initial Skyrim sales, it soon became the best place to play the game. The ability to create mods and the increasingly more powerful systems available on a budget meant that Skyrim on PC would take on a life of its own. Over the course of 2012, Bethesda released 3 downloadable content packs for Skyrim. The final expansion, released in December 2012, brought players to Solstheim, itself its own open world. By April 2013, Bethesda announced that development for Skyrim had ended. Though we now look back at Skyrim and see it available on every system, in hindsight, these re-releases made sense and were years apart. It only seems like they were released in rapid-fire succession, and every new port or re-release of the game was an event, and they have all sold well. In June 2013, Bethesda released the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim Legendary Edition, which included all of the patches for the game, plus the 3 expansions Dawnguard, Hearthfire, and Dragonborn. This was essentially the complete version of the game for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. In fall 2016, Bethesda released Skyrim Special Edition for the Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and PC. This was a remastered version of the game and included, according to Bethesda, all new features like remastered art and effects, volumetric god rays, dynamic depth of field, screen space reflections, and more. The special edition also brought mods to home consoles for the first time, a highly requested feature for gamers that weren't comfortable with modding on PC. Before the Skyrim Special Edition actually released in late October 2016, Skyrim was prominently featured in the Nintendo Switch reveal trailer. This was major news at the time because Bethesda had not made a game for a Nintendo console since Home Alone released for the original Nintendo Entertainment System all the way back in 1991. Indeed, Skyrim released for the Nintendo Switch in November 2017, capitalizing on the success of the system in a way that other developers were hesitant to do so. Bethesda even collaborated with Nintendo to include special Zelda content specific to the Switch version of the game. They also incorporated gyroscopic controls, making ranged attacks like archery far easier to perform on the Switch than on any other console. Finally, Bethesda released a VR version of Skyrim for the PlayStation VR in November 2017, with additional ports of the game made available for PC VR in April of 2018. So, all in all, Skyrim saw 4 distinct releases across 8 platforms since it has been released. Because there has still not been a new release in the Elder Scrolls series, Skyrim and all of its re-releases have become a reminder for those who love the series that there is still quite a wait ahead of us. With every new port of the game, and no announcement for The Elder Scrolls 6, the cries from fans would grow louder and louder. Finally, at E3 2018, Bethesda relented and gave us the slightest bit of information, but at least formally announced the development and impending release of The Elder Scrolls 6. That means we can finally start to fully appreciate what Skyrim has done for fans, the industry, and for Bethesda. Between Fallout 3 and Skyrim, Bethesda went from just another game developer to one of the premier game-making companies in the world. Though they have had recent struggles, it was only recently that their name has become somewhat tarnished. Skyrim put Bethesda on the map in a big way. The changes they made to the series allowed for the game to be embraced by the average gamer in a way Morrowind and Oblivion could not. Even the combat, which seems archaic by today's standards, was much better and more easily understood in Skyrim compared to Oblivion. Bethesda created a much more dynamic, beautiful world, and then refined all of the quests and in-game mechanics so that everyone could enjoy it. Some of these changes are perceived by hardcore series veterans to be dumbing down the game, but the results speak for themselves. We are now finally on the other side of the mountain, counting down toward the release of The Elder Scrolls 6, rather than toward the announcement of its development. It has been a long time coming, but we can now properly appreciate the way Skyrim changed gaming forever. Hopefully, Bethesda will be able to repeat this feat with the release of The Elder Scrolls 6. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe.